the early service, I noted that this seems like an odd song to be singing with the weather doing what it's been doing. Today we hear one of the favorite parables of Jesus telling. It's a parable that is so familiar that often people reference it. And sometimes people don't even know the whole story, but some of us who do, it's easy for us to start to hear it and say, oh, I know this one, and believe that we know all that it's about, and so we shut down, we stop listening. And so what I want to do is invite you to not do that. And the way I'd like to do that is to ask you to focus on what's going on inside of you as you experience the words of this story that Jesus tells when there is a grumbling around him. Listen to the story, but experience what it speaks inside of you and pay attention to when you experience grace. The Holy Gospel according to Luke, the 15th chapter. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So Jesus told them this parable. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to be one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare? But here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he has got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. he was lost and has been found. The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. One of the gifts of being in a congregation that has stained glass windows is that we're surrounded by the story. We're surrounded by images of our faith. And so today I thought that maybe I'd risk putting an image up on the screen to give you something that, for those of you who have eyes and minds that tend to wander while the pastor's talking, for you. This is a 17th century painting by Rembrandt called The Return of the Prodigal. And it may be worth pondering as we listen to God's word. Now back to the question. As you listen to and hear and experience Jesus telling this parable, speaking these words to you, where in that parable, at what points did you experience God's grace? Where did you feel grace? Maybe it was not just in one place. Maybe there were several places in the parable. Perhaps at the very beginning, when that younger son came to his father and said, you know, he was a classic younger son, right? He wanted to get out and live his life. He was so eager to live his life and get out there and do all the things and explore what it meant to be who he was, that he just couldn't wait. And so he goes to his father and he says, give me my share of the inheritance. Now, what we know about inheritance is it doesn't come to you until somebody's died. And so this son has come to his father and fundamentally said, I wish you were dead. Give me what's coming to me. Now, as the younger son, there are a variety of understandings. Some would say that as the younger son in that culture, he probably didn't get anything. His share would be really not much of anything. Now, others point to some scriptural mandates that would suggest that 2/3 would go to the older brother and 1/3 would go to the younger brother. But still, Dad's not dead yet. And so in this moment when the son comes to the father, perhaps you experienced a bit of grace. A father who hears the request of his son, and no matter what the son deserved according to the culture, the father sells property, because quite honestly, wealth was in the property. And to give that son his share, he had to sell that property. And the father releases him, lets him go to explore the world. Perhaps there's some grace in there. Maybe it is in the return that we experience the grace. That this son who has gone out and he has squandered everything and there is nothing left, and he has hired himself out to work with the pigs of all things. Good Jewish people would be offended by that. And so now even the pods that he was feeding, he didn't eat those pods. Nobody gave him anything. And finally he came to his senses and he said, I've blown it. I'm going to go home. And I will hire myself out to my father. I can't be his son anymore because I've already spent my share, right? So when he comes home, we see them in the foreground there. Before he can even say that rehearsed line, before he can do anything, his father hikes up his robes and runs to him. Perhaps you experience some grace in that moment when a parent risks disgrace for himself. Because quite honestly, when the father hikes up his robe and runs, that was not a done deal in his culture. At the very least, it risked exposure. It risked bringing disgrace upon him. And yet this father runs out to this son, and before he can say anything, he gives him a hug and he kisses him. And even after the rehearsed line, the father calls for a robe and sandals and a ring and all these signs of claiming this child as his own. Perhaps there's grace in that moment. Maybe in the shadows, way back there towards the middle of the picture, you see the older son. Here is a son who stayed put. He has been faithful. He has taken care of business. And while the younger son hired himself out as a servant, as a slave, this one is pretty confident he stayed and he has worked as a slave and he has obeyed everything. I've done everything right. I've done things the way they ought to be done. I have not failed you, Father. But when he hears those words that his brother has come home and they're throwing a party and everything is hunky-dory and wonderful, he gets angry. Perhaps you hear grace when the father comes out to him, just as he came out to that younger son. That the father comes to the one who is estranged, the one who is cut off, the one who is outside, and reaches out to him and invites him and welcomes him in and says, "You are as much a part of me, and all that has been mine is yours." Perhaps there is grace in a father who reaches out. Maybe you experienced grace in a parent who creates space. A parent who opens up a space for his children to figure out who they are, whether they need to go away, and blesses them on their leaving and blesses them on their return, or those children who need to stay closer to home, and he blesses them in their work and in what they need to do. Perhaps you heard grace, experienced grace in that moment of knowing a space created by a parent whose love was that big to meet the child where the child is. Those are some of the places I can think of. Maybe you experienced grace in a different place. One of the things that Rembrandt does with this picture, you'll notice that those folks are dressed fairly nobly. It suggests that Rembrandt understood that while this story is placed in the first century, Rembrandt understood that maybe God's story is a story that speaks to us where we are in our world. And so I ask the question again. Where do you experience grace in this story? And beyond that, where do you experience a grace like that in the dailiness, in the reality of your life. Think about, identify a time when you have experienced God's grace, a free gift that is brought to you, that meets you where you are, whether you have needed to go away or whether you have stayed close to home, a grace that has met you in whatever it is. Think of that moment. Ponder it, imagine it. Imagine yourself back into that time, that place. Brain researchers tell us that the place in our brain where our memories of feelings and emotions are stored knows no time. So when we enter into that space where we experience those feelings, no matter how long ago they were, they become real to us right now in the present time. They're available to us now. So what I want you to do is invite you to ponder that place in your life where you have experienced grace. And feel that moment. Experience it again. And as you do, pay attention to see if there is a word, one word, that bubbles up for you. What is that word? Now, I know that moments when we need grace, circumstances like that are not things we share easily, so I don't want you to share that, all right? But I would like you to turn to your neighbor and share what the word is that describes that moment when you experience grace. Turn to your neighbor and share the word. Theoretically, if it's one word, I shouldn't have to give you much time, right? I pray that whatever word, whatever experience you have, was a positive one. I pray that it was positive because, quite honestly, God's love releases us so that we may return. God's love seeks us out, runs to us, embraces us, holds us, seeks us. Because God's love invites us and welcomes us. Sometimes even when we aren't so sure that we deserve it. God's grace is like that.